Before we get started today, I first want to welcome everybody. I really appreciate your time. I know your time is valuable, and we hope this session is very valuable for you. The webinar will be recorded, so you'll be able to share it with colleagues and/or come back and review if there's some information you want to revisit. We hope the session is very valuable, as I said, and exciting. We're going to address something that we're often asked here at LRN, which is what are other companies doing? And while our program effectiveness report, which will be shared to the general public shortly, and other analytics address that from a data perspective, today is going to be a conversation. So we've invited two esteemed E&C professionals here to discuss their programs. There are many different ways to run a successful program. So this session is not intended to be prescriptive, but rather expose you to different ways to run your program and maybe some tidbits that you can use to take a look at to improve your program. We'll have discussions on topics like how do you plan for your curriculum? What is your E&C structure? How do you prioritize risk topics? Who else are you dealing with in the business? While we'll have poll questions, I encourage you to also ask questions in the chat, and we'll try to address those today. For those that we don't get to, we'll address afterwards. And also, if you have comments on something that we're discussing at the moment, please enter those in the chat on how you're actually doing it within your business. So first, let's introduce you to who the heck you're talking to here, which I will be the moderator. I head up the Senior Vice President of Client Success at LRN. I've been with LRN for 5 years. I'll date myself a bit here. I've been in the learning industry since the late 80s, early 90s, starting as an instructional designer, developer, and manager of operations building content. Latter part of my career, more on the relationship side of the business. Joining me today is Jennifer Douglas, who works for Corteva as their ethics and compliance officer for North America. She's been with the business for 3 years, with agricultural industry for 25 years, 12 of which have been spent with ethics and compliance. In her current role, she's responsible for implementing and maintaining an effective ethics and compliance program for a region comprising of 9,000 employees with $8 billion in net sales. Additionally, she has global responsibility for ethics and compliance training program in the business ethics risk. Vicki Palmer works for Cooper Standard Automotive as a senior counsel of global ethics and compliance. For that business, E&C is part of their legal department at CPS. She's been an attorney for 30 years, 5 of which have been with CPS, and 10 of which have been with a variety of different compliance roles. Her primary responsibilities include leading cross-functional teams that address training content, communications, policies, procedures, risk management, and a host of other E&C strategies, tactics, and tasks. Jennifer and Vicki, with that, I want to extend many, many thanks for joining us today. Are you ready to go?
Yes, I am.
All right, let's do it. Quickly here, the agenda for all. We've covered off welcome and introductions. We're going to jump into a panel discussion. Interspersed throughout that will be poll questions. You can throw questions in the chat. We've got a few other folks joining us from LRN that can answer some of those as we go. We'll hold some of them for the end as we do QA and then move to a closing. So, Carol, I think we can jump to our first poll question. Who owns ethics and compliance training within your particular organization? Okay, the results are shared here. I don't know if folks are still entering. It's not surprising. There are varying answers here. And I think as we have this discussion, you'll see varying answers from our panelists. So we've got the lead is that it's centralized at 49%. Carol, I've closed that. If we can run to our first question for the panelists. Essentially the same question, but focusing on is this centralized or decentralized? Jennifer, I'll start with you at Corteva.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Paul. So yes, at Corteva, our ethics and compliance training program is centralized. So we focus on training for 9 core compliance risk areas. And then we develop an annual training plan for each of those risk areas every year. So that training plan is developed based on our annual risk assessment process, our investigations data, and then changes in the external environment or new regulations that may evolve. So, yep.
Okay, Vicky?
Yeah, we are centralized, but we are part of the legal department. And, again, like as with Jennifer, we have a number of cross-functional initiatives and working groups that ethics and compliance has a seat at the table. So, um, we do a lot with the other functions in the company to hear what their challenges might be in this area.
Okay. From an LRM, higher level anecdotal perspective, I think we see this fairly split down the middle. Many companies have centralized, but there's a fair share that is decentralized. HR may take care of AHD, IT might take care of cybersecurity, data privacy, and then it varies on how those different organizations talk together. So we'll address that as well if we can move to the next question. So you both mentioned the relationships with other businesses. So what are those different relationships, and do you see those expanding, and how do you actually coordinate that? Some organizations have councils and such to actually make sure there's best practices shared. Vicky, maybe you could take the lead on this one.
Okay, well, we have a mature enterprise risk management process that we go through every year, and that is comprised of subject matter experts from the various functions, and that meets once a year, but it's a long process, and there's a number of working groups. We have a human rights working group that meets quarterly, and it also, help put together our corporate responsibility report. So we hear a lot of issues come up there. Also have a sustainability council, and so some of the more, I guess, due diligence types of questions come up that, or governance. It's a broad expanse of topics that are discussed.
And is that all coordinated at the end of a year, planning for the following year, or at the beginning of the year or throughout?
As far as me using that
Yeah,
information
yeah,
for
yeah.
our planning purposes, I'd say the enterprise risk management process that we go through a whole risk assessment. We identify the risk, we rate them, we prioritize them, and then at the end of that process, there's our each function would have its main focus risks, and we have about 8, and those are the risks. There's a whole ton of risks, but those are the risks
Great.
that I would focus on, that I want to cover annually, usually annually, excuse me. And then, you know, that usually informs the whole process of my planning for the upcoming year.
Okay, thank you. Jennifer, how do you work across the different business units?
Sure. So we have relationships with a lot of different business areas within the organization, but I think there are two that, in my opinion, have been core to supporting our not only our ENC program, but our training initiatives. The first group would be our executive leaders. So obviously they're the ones setting the tone for the rest of the company. And so we want to be there to help set them up for success, to make sure they're setting that tone and articulating our ethical standards in alignment with our code of conduct and such. And so they comprise our ethics and compliance committee that meets quarterly. And so they are involved in our annual ethics and compliance risk assessment. They're providing input into it. They know what our highest risks are because they're part of those conversations. And then we're also, keeping them up to date and apprised of other things like changes to those risk areas, our investigations metrics, program changes, and things like that. So when it comes then to our annual training plan that we put together, they've been involved in that risk assessment. They know what our highest risks are. And so, they are very supportive. And in some respects, promote some of that training. So for example, I remember we had a risk assessment discussion, and one of our executive leaders, talked about the fact we really need to provide some refresher training in this particular risk area to these parts of our organization. And that's just a great place to be when you have your executive leaders saying, hey, we need this training versus just the ethics and compliance team doing that. So I think they've been a core piece or core relationship that's been important to our program. I think the second area that's been really important to us is our partnership with legal. So we partner together with them to deliver some very targeted training on our compliance risk areas in person and through webinars. And so we do that in order to allow our employees to ask questions, to have a discussion, to provide, some very specific scenarios or examples that relate to their region or their business and such. And so, for example, our legal team may help us disseminate or have those conversations around antitrust or responsible business communications. And we track all of those live in-person or webinar type trainings that we do. And if it wasn't for our partnership with them, our reach would not be as great on some of these compliance risk areas. So those are just a couple that I think have been really important to our program.
Great. Thanks, Jennifer. Carol, I think why don't we roll to the next poll question and section we're going to address here. So how is the ethics and compliance training curriculum actually delivered? I suspect there'll be multiple answers again here, but if you can fill in the question there and the responses. So it looks like the leader here is annually set it up all up front, launch it. And I think that I'm guessing that means then we give the folks the year or a longer period of time to get through all the courses they're assigned to. That before I ask the question of you, Jennifer and Vicki, that aligns to there's one of our businesses we work with, a very large service organization, does it that way. They launch, pre-market and launch everything in January. And then essentially folks have until December to finish, but they have different courses that they send different reminders to try to get completions earlier than end of the year to try to space things out. So with that said, Vicki, I'll pose the question for you to start with. What's the frequency and on how you launch? Is it all those 8 topic or risk areas that you mentioned and the courses that go with them, in January and then let it run, or are you running things throughout the year based on different variables?
We run it throughout the year, usually on a quarterly cadence. We'll send out the mandatory training. So just to a little more background, the mandatory training goes to a global salaried population, and there's other functions that have training for health and safety or in the plants. Or internally for HR, but ours is the global salary population. And these are the topics, as I mentioned, like the most important topics that we need to cover on a regular basis. And we also have quarterly, we send out what we call integrity spotlights. They're through our social media or an email to the same population. And it's just on maybe a more current topic. It's a policy summary or a short video will go with that. And sometimes it may reinforce the previous mandatory training that was sent out, but that's the approach that we take.
Is there for any of those risk areas that you're addressing, are there any that alternate on a yearly basis, or are all of those covered every year?
No, I have a list of priority, like categorized, like priority 1, 2, and 3. And number 1, we try to train annually on. Number 2, maybe every other year, and 3, every third year. But even within that, we mix up the depth. Like we'll sometimes do a full-length course, and then maybe the following year it's covered in code of conduct training, which would just be a much less deep presentation of the topic. So we do try to mix it up that way.
Great. Thanks, Vicki. Jennifer?
Yeah, so I would say in terms of training frequency, based on roles and risk areas, Largely driven by our risk assessment, but I'd put it into three categories for us. So like our first category is new employee training. So we really want to provide our code of conduct and a conflicts of interest disclosure to our new employees in their first 90 days. So we run 4 new employee training programs throughout the year to kind of gather up new employees from that last quarter. Then second, we have our population of current global employees. And so on an annual basis, we want to provide them just a refresher on some key risk areas driven by our annual risk assessment. And then we'll also do our annual certification or disclosure process with those employees as well. And that's one annual global campaign that we run in the fall. And then the third category that we focus on are those employees that are working in a compliance area that might be a little higher risk. And so for that group of employees, we're doing targeted training with them on an as needed basis by risk area, by region, by business area. It may be computer based, but in a lot of cases, it's a live webinar to encourage questions and discussions. So to give you an example, last year at the beginning of our sales season for our North America commercial organization, we did a partnership with legal to talk to them about competitor interactions and gifts and entertainment and responsible business communications, all those things that were going to be critical for them just in time or just ahead of their peak sales season. So that's kind of how we think about the different roles and risk areas and the timing of the training we provide to those groups.
I think I asked this to Vicki earlier, but that risk assessment you do, what time of year do you do that ahead of planning for your next year's program?
Yeah, we do our annual. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, we do ours annually in September, our annual
September.
ethics and compliance risk assessment. Yep.
Vicki, how about you?
Yeah, ours is in the spring, and I can't say that's not the only thing that feeds into our planning process. So I mean, I don't know that that's really relevant when a company would do that. It's just the fact that it's annual and it keeps things current, and everybody is always focused on what's emerging and has anything increased. So I mean, I think it's a very important process, but I don't know that it's necessarily tied into our training, training frequency.
Thank you. All right, let's run to the next question. So you've both in some of the responses I mentioned working across other groups. And I think Vicki, you alluded to health and safety. Do other divisions' training needs affect the decisions on how and when you actually launch your training? Vicki, if you could start.
Not so much, really. I mean, as I mentioned, other functions have their own training, and I know our IT has its big cyber security month, I think is October. So I know that they're always going to launch something then, and I try to avoid that. But much of the training that other functions do, it's specific to certain roles or regions where this is a global, what I do is the global training. So, and it's not all that frequent that it would really pile up on, regardless of what function you're in, I don't think.
Okay. Jennifer?
Yeah, so one of the things that we have here at Corteva is our Learning Council, and it's comprised of training professionals from the different business areas across the company. And our goal is to come together once a quarter and really try to provide a positive and effective learning experience for our employees. So some of the things that we're working together on cross-functionally is looking at any kind of training that is broad in scope or is going to be enterprise-wide. And we're just trying to ensure that we don't have multiple enterprise training initiatives all happening at the same time. We really want to balance our employees' time commitment to training throughout the year. And so that's one of the ways that we do that. And then that team can also serve as, representatives within their function to drive awareness of training from other business areas and functions so that folks know what training is going on at what time. We have an enterprise training calendar so that we can help balance that training for employees. And so, for example, our ethics and compliance team, we always do our annual global training in October and November every year, and that's known by our learning council. And so then if we have other large, enterprise trainings that we need to fit in during the year, we try to avoid that time to help kind of balance the training time commitment amongst our employees.
Yeah. I would say, and I'd ask a few of my colleagues to chime in via chat if you can, but I would say we see it both ways. So we've seen a split here. We've seen some organizations approach it the way you did, Vicki, and others, are really focused on reducing training time and learner fatigue across the organization, and that could be on courses, that you might be responsible for, or it could be on more of a global view, like you were talking about, Jennifer. Let's roll on to the next thing. And I think we've addressed some of this, so you might be revisiting some of your responses here. But when you look at the risk universe, what are the criteria that help you decide on those topics? You both have mentioned risk assessments and different groups that are looking at that. But what are those teams, along with you, looking at to help formulate your plan? I think we ended with Jennifer, so let's continue with our alternation here. Vicki, if you would run with this one.
Yeah, I think as far as what everyone's risk universe, how they define that, it's just that would be regulatory changes and updates, political, geographical, financial, they all come from a different, world in that sense, that the risks are different. And so what ethics and compliance is our training is really focused on the regulatory and legal risks to the company. So it would be different than, the focus on supply chain due diligence that's going on in so many places. I mean, it touches on that, some of it, but it's the topics don't vary all that much as far as the mandatory training from year to year. I mean, the focus and the scenarios and the training itself might, but we really use when there's an emerging risk or some new topic that would affect the company broadly, we use more of the integrity spotlight or short communications to try to address those that I mean, if you think of it, Gen AI, that you never heard of 5 years, it's just so common now that's the type of thing that, the risks in that are often just, even though it's a very new risk topic, the risks involved have been there for a long time. Confidentiality, records management, those types of things that are something we try to train on regularly. It's in Gen AI, those same risks can exist. And so if you're training, it's not like you can't acknowledge that there are new risks because of that. But I think we reserve those emerging topics for our shorter communications as opposed to our mandatory training.
You mentioned supplier, and you mentioned the regs don't change that often, but for taking a look at that, is there any person or people responsible for Horizon monitoring, or is it just the general collective that is taking that to your risk teams?
Well, I think if we are in the legal department, ethics and compliance is part of the legal department. So, I mean, that's a really good question, because it'd be great to know how any new regulation affects anyone in our company. But I can't, like an HR law or, a labor law changes in one of the states or regions where we operate. the legal department's not necessarily going to know about that. So
Right.
those types of things, they come out in the whole enterprise risk management process. That's the ideal anyway, that the subject matter experts that are involved in that whole process would discuss these things and how likely are they to happen? What are we doing now to prevent this? And it does, if it's important enough and global enough, it would reach, it could arise to where we would send out mandatory training on it. But a lot of times those more local issues are handled by regional counsel or HR in those areas.
Okay, great. Thanks, Vicki. Jennifer?
Yeah, so when it comes to looking at kind of our risk universe and determining what criteria we're going to use to determine what we include in our training for, if I obviously our risk assessment is very important in that we're looking at our higher scoring risk versus our moderate to lower scoring risk and determining, if we need to include those higher risks in our annual all employee training, or if that's something that we need to target to certain groups throughout the organization. We're also looking at our ethics investigation trends to see, if there's anything there that we feel like we need to target in our annual all employee training versus targeted training. And so that's kind of how we think about it and how we decide, what we're going to include for all employees versus, more targeted training. We may also consider common questions we're getting from employees. And so our annual all employee training is usually computer-based. It's a code of conduct refresher course that we develop with LRN. And so even if we need to do a little bit of targeted training there, we do that through some role profiling questions where we can target folks that, if we need to do something on data privacy or interactions with competitors or interactions with government officials, we can target those employees still through that computer-based training. But then in addition to that, through our partnership with legal, we can also try to do some more targeted training on some of those topics in webinars or in-person training and things like that in order to refresh or hit some of those additional risks.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's probably a great lead into our next topic. So let's roll there. Well, actually, we kind of talked about this. How do we incorporate those risks? You were starting that with that, Jennifer. How we do that. So I actually want to, for the sake of time, actually go to our next broad topic. Before we do that, there was a poll question to go with that. So how much time do you give the learners to actually complete the annual courses? Or I suppose this could be a specific course too. All right, so nobody's at the short end, which is good. So looks like the range is from 21 to a longer period of time, with the weight being on the higher end. So let's toss this to you, Vicki. And I think you mentioned your program is launched up front. Let's first address the time, how much time you give, and then we'll talk about how you drive to the completion statistics you're attaining there.
Okay, well, we actually send it out quarterly, but generally we allow 45 days. We send out a disclosure every year, and that's much shorter, allow a couple of weeks for that. It's just some questions. It's not really training. But we find that, we don't want to burden team members, but if it's much longer than that, it just falls off the radar. And we find if they don't do it in the first 2 weeks, it seems like you're reminding, sending overdue notices. So I think 2 weeks would be too short for our company, but that's what we found is about 45 to 60 days, depending on the course.
Okay. So then within the ones that are not completing it within that kind of upfront period where they typically hope to be, how do you drive the completion accountability? You mentioned reminders, but are there other tactics?
Yeah, we would. We send there's built-in reminders, in the campaign and overdue notices. But at a certain point, we found that it's helpful to involve regional HR because, we elevate it to the manager at some point in the overdue process. But, trying that a couple of times, we found it's really very helpful to involve their regional HR business partner in the process.
Great. Jennifer, on the timing allowed, and then how do you drive completion?
Yeah, sure. So for the majority of our campaigns that are computer-based, like our new employee campaigns and then our global annual all-employee campaigns, we run those at around 60 days. And we drive all of those campaigns to 100% completion. And I think one of the things, in my opinion, that's really helped us to achieve that is we've really tried to build a brand around our ethics and compliance training. And what I mean by that is both visually through messaging and then also through some of the values that we put in place around our ethics and compliance training. So you'll probably see behind me, we have I completed my I Comply training. So I Comply is our ethics and compliance brand. And you'll see the logo that we have for I Comply. And we message I Comply as your learning platform for ethics and compliance training. So not only do we have a logo and some visuals, that are recognized by all of our employees globally. Every communication we have that goes out about our ethics and compliance training comes from our I Comply email address. If an employee has questions or needs technical support, it goes to our I Comply, mailbox. So everything around our campaign is visually, branded I Comply. And then when it comes to our messaging and communication, we take a global approach. All of our communications are available in 16 languages. We really try to be positive in the messages that we send out to employees to provide, key information that they and their leaders need through our announcements at the beginning of campaigns to really help them and support them to complete that training. And then when I talked about some of the values that we incorporate into, our overall brand for I Comply, in our annual training campaign, we have module consistency. So every year employees know there's going to be a code of conduct refresher course and our annual disclosure or certification process. We've made a time commitment to them, meaning that our refresher course and disclosure will be 30 minutes or less. And we track that metric every year. So they know when they go take their annual training, they can do that in less than 30 minutes. We've also committed to them that in that 60-day time frame, if you complete your training in the first 30 days, we won't send you any reminder messages. We're usually at about 70% complete by that point in time. And then when it comes to questions that they have, or if they need technical support, if they email us at our I Comply email address, we respond within 1 business day or less. And so we've really tried to build not only a visual brand, but some branding around our messaging and some of the values that we put in place around our training program or I Comply. And I think that's really helped us from a brand recognition perspective to hit some of our completion rates. When we get to our due date, we're usually at about 99% complete. And so that last 1% of our population, then we're usually engaging, our next level leaders to help provide support in getting us to 100% completion at that point in time.
So you mentioned the 70%. So, looking at it from a historical perspective, have you found your chasing has been reduced with all the strategies and tactics you've mentioned?
Yeah, I definitely think so. In terms of, the number of reminder messages and such that we have to send in that second 30 days to employees and their leaders and such, I do think that we've seen a reduction in that with some of the tactics that we've put in place. And like I said, kind of creating that recognizable brand around I Comply. Sure.
Okay, thank you. Carol, let's hop to the next one. This was addressed a little bit, I think, in some of your replies, and for the sake of time, let's not do both. I'll have one of you jump in if you would. Oh, actually, we're going to move forward. That's fine. I think we can move forward. I think that was addressed. Earlier, I mentioned you had segued, Jennifer, to something you had closed with in a previous section. I actually thought this section was going to come up, so I apologize to the audience here, because you were mentioning some ways that you reinforce the learners. So if you could take the lead on this one, I know you just stopped your session or your answer previously, but if you could lead again here, and then we'll turn to Vicki. What are ways that you reinforce to make sure the learners are actually engaged and you're actually driving behavior change and the learners are actually getting something out of the training? So that would be things like pre-marketing the course. That would be things like newsletter, meeting moment events. I think you've mentioned in our prep or even today. Some of those types of things that, learning as an individual event needs to be quality and effective to engage the learner, but also learning over time and reinforcing those messages, make sure that learners are actually going to perform and adhere to the cultures and the values and principles that you're aspiring to.
Yeah, so maybe I'll dive just a little bit deeper into a few of the tactics that I mentioned previously that we use in terms of reinforcement and engagement. So at the beginning of all of our annual I Comply campaign that goes to all global employees, our Chief Ethics and Risk Officer will send out a message to all global employees, kind of launching the campaign, may even do a video around that. And then we use the announcement features within the LRN tool. We'll send an announcement to all employees that tells them, here's the training you need to take, the due date, here's some important information you need to know to complete that training. We'll do one to their leaders as well for key information they need to support their employees throughout the campaign. And we'll attach a list of their direct reports that were assigned to the training. We send all of our communications out in 16 languages so that we know every employee has the opportunity to read and understand those messaging. And then, as we get into the tactical piece, of the second half of our campaign and doing reminders, we do weekly reminders to employees in the second half of our campaign. And then the last 2 weeks is when we engage leaders and we start sending a weekly message to them as well with a report attached that says, here are the employees in your that directly report to you that have not yet completed that training, and we encourage them, to help them find time in their schedule to complete that by the due date. And so those are a few of the tactics that we use. We also try to create some engagement around our training. We'll do some social media scoreboards, which business area or country or region of the world is leading in training completion. And so we found that we have a lot of employees that liked that piece this year as well. So,
yeah, you mentioned I think in our prep meeting moments and ways to reinforce the messaging. So after the training, is there something and things that you do a month later, or 2 months later, or 6 months later to reinforce? For instance, I know code is huge. As you roll that out in your organization, are there things that follow that to keep reinforcing that throughout the year when the learner's done with that particular learning event?
yeah, absolutely. So I would say there's probably a couple of things that we do outside of the training campaign. One, and I'll focus a little bit on our people leaders here. So one, we provide a people leader toolkit, that kind of outlines, why their role matters, how to talk to their teams about ethics and compliance, and what to do when an employee raises a concern. We also do a monthly Be Upstanding bulletin or article and value moment for all of our employees, so that we can cover key topics throughout the year through those articles, but then also provide, a one-slide value moment that leaders can use to kick off team meetings, so that they're always starting team meetings and town halls with a safety moment and an ethics value moment, which is a strong part of our culture, to reinforce some of those ethics and compliance messages. In addition to that, after our training, I mentioned that we do an annual disclosure certification process. So if an employee discloses that, hey, I interact with competitors, or hey, I interact with government officials, we'll also do an email communication to them after our annual campaign. And it'll just have some additional resources in it, some optional training, things like our policy, frequently asked questions, maybe decision trees, such like that, just to help reinforce some just-in-time resources for them who are interacting with some of those external parties. So those are a couple of the ways that we try to reinforce key messaging after our training campaign.
Okay, great. Vicki, anything for you as far as reinforcing the learning? After a 30-minute course or 20-minute course is deployed, is there anything that follows that throughout the year?
Yeah, I mean, it just depends on what the training was on. I mean, typically beforehand, we'll send out an announcement, and it'll often have a link to the policy that the training is going to cover, so they have a chance to review that. And then there's the actual training, and then at some point afterwards, we try to follow up with just short video or short communication on our social media about the topic, and that'll often have a link to, very short training or some type of help aid. And we also several times a year send out speak up reminders. And the day before we send that out, we'll send a separate announcement to all people managers, just saying, "Hey, this is coming tomorrow," and if your direct reports have questions about that, here are some resources you can use to address that. Like, depending on what the actual topic is, sometimes it's on our non-retaliation policy, or it may be on some other area of opportunity. Our ethical culture survey showed that we need to address. So anytime we feel that managers might be faced with more questions from their employees on some topic, we'll often engage with them separately and let them know that we do have resources for them.
Okay. You said a key word to start with, which I want to focus on, which is it depends. And so we do find that, for you both talked about rating the risks, for the higher rated risks, for the more mission critical type things that are going to affect the business, those things that you've both mentioned become more critical, rather than just relying on a 30-minute course, to reinforce that through different mechanisms throughout the year to make sure that the messages and the learning is actually occurring. Why don't we move forward, Carol? I think you both talked about this, and we're butting up against time here. I think we want to allow enough time here for Q&A, but I think you both addressed that. We'll have a poll question. So, what area is your organization focused on improving in 2026 as you look at your compliance roadmap? So we're spread here a bit, strengthening the partnerships, improving risk strategy. Data analytics is 20%, and then towards the bottom, we've got updating policies for new regs. I believe, Carol, we're rolling to Q&A at this point. I've got a few questions in the chat. Of course, more are welcome at this point. I think this is probably intended for you, Jennifer, which is, how do you set the tone with the top leaders over and above having conversations about the risks and the metrics and changes in the environment? Specific examples are, if you have them. So, for example, we asked them to have quarterly conversations during the departmental meetings and give them talking points. Was the example given. So the main question is, how do you set the tone with your top leaders and disseminate that information?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously we are meeting with them quarterly, like I talked about, and we're having conversations, about all of our risk assessment, and we're providing them updates on our risk mitigation plan and reporting out on those. We're covering a lot of key areas with them about investigations and the trends we're seeing and what areas maybe they should focus on in their organizations. We're talking about external changes in the regulatory environment and how that may impact, some of the things that we're doing and some of our programs and those types of things. And then in addition to that, we do have, just like I think the Q&A recommended, is we also every month are providing those leaders again with what we call our Be Upstanding value moment, where they can, go out on our mobile app or on our ethics and compliance SharePoint and grab some of that content that we've put together for them on topics that we know are higher risk for us, or they're a common question for an employee, or they're an investigation trend that we're seeing. And then they can incorporate that into their team meetings and just have a quick, 5-minute ethics pause or values moment or something like that to get them, to continue having them set that tone for their employees. Because if their employees hear them, talking about ethics and compliance and know that ethics matters to them, then, we see a huge improvement in that, it mattering to employees as well. So.
Okay, thank you.
Hope that helps.
Yep, it does. this one's geared for you, Jennifer, but I think Vicky, you can answer it too because it's what are the 9 core areas that you had mentioned earlier that you had to address, 9 core risk areas. Jennifer.
Yep, sure. So our 9 compliance risk areas are anti-bribery and anti-corruption, antitrust, business ethics, data privacy, government interactions, insider trading, joint venture governance, trade compliance, and records management. Those are the risk areas that we focus on.
And Vicky, if I recall correctly, 8, I think you had 8.
Yeah. My fingertips, I don't, very similar to Jennifer's list.
Okay.
Because we're publicly traded, insider trading is one of our topics as well. But yeah, it's very similar to that. I think data security, even though that's kind of an IT topic, it really runs into so much of it is, you know, part of legal as well. So that would be covered under our area. So a very similar list, I'd say.
Okay. Angela, if you got a chance here, I know you work across many of our clients. If you got a chance to throw in what you think the leading ones in either my chat or this chat, that'd be great. Let's see. One of the questions was it's not targeted to either one, so either can jump in. But what are you reviewing as part of the annual risk assessment? I think some of that was in your replies, but are there specific things to answer this question? And I think Artie, you had asked this question. If you found the answer in the as we were discussing, let me know, and we can move on. But maybe Jennifer or Vicky, you can take a stab at it to start with.
I'm not sure if the question is regarding what the entire process looks at or just the
I think
legal and compliance, what we look at.
Yeah, I think let's just focus maybe on what you look at, Vicky.
Well, it falls under legal and compliance, but there are risks that we look at that you wouldn't typically. It could be a lot of labor issues, just because, you know, could it result in a lawsuit, or so it's really even broader than what we train at. You know, our top risks are, but there's IT risks, human rights issues that, you know, that would fall under maybe more HR related, some of that. But the whole process, it looks at operational risks, financial risk, legal and compliance is one of them. There's really like 5 main risk areas, and there's a lot of overlap in between that. I mean, every function has financial risks or operate, you know, but that's the way that we do the process. And so included in our list is a lot of risks that would, you know, you might think of as more of an IT risk, you know, but it really falls under our for this process, it falls into our category of risk.
Okay, thank you. There's some follow-up questions on repeating the risk areas, but for sake of time, Jennifer, Natalie, we'll address that offline. That will also be in our PEI report that's going to be coming up. There's going to be a lot of data in there, and we'll be sure to get that out to this audience, but it also goes out to our client portfolio as well. So there will be a lot of data, and I think the risk areas people are focusing on is one of the questions for this year too. So, but we'll follow up with that. One last question before we move on here, and I think move to a closing. I apologize, both of you. I can't remember which one talked about this, but why target salaried employees only for mandatory training?
I don't know that they're the only ones that receive mandatory training. There's in our company anyway, the hourly team members also receive training. It's just the focus on hours would, you know, we look at all what our functions are doing at that level globally, and they may be exposed, you know, more likely to be exposed to some of these regulatory and legal risks than someone who's in a facility. They're not dealing with our business partners necessarily, are exposed to confidential information. So, you know, the the focus, that's just our focus. It doesn't mean our hourly employees receive no training. They do. It's just we're not responsible for that piece. I mean, I work with HR, and they do send out a code of conduct training there. They don't have laptops, so there's different means of deploying that training that they work on. But they do receive training. It's just not from our from Global Ethics and Compliance.
Okay. Edwin asked a question, and I'll actually take this one. You guys have been talking a lot, so I'll take this one. How can we ensure that training effectively addresses the real and evolving risk employees face daily, e.e. the mining industry, rather than becoming just a check the box exercise? So it's a large loaded question. I'll talk to it from an instructional design perspective. And both of you have mentioned things like role profiling, but making sure the training is contextual is very important. If it's not contextual to the learner, you face the risk of learners tuning out. The design of the courses and/or communications you send out are very important to make sure that it's engaging the learners, whether it's how you're utilizing media or interactivity. If it's in a course, there's just a lot of different factors that go into making sure that those learners are engaged. Jennifer, you mentioned the whole brand and culture you've created there. That's a method to create that engagement so that, when learners walk into a training, there's a what's in it for me. It's not just trying to get through it as quickly as I can to go on to the next task because we know we're all busy. So you really got to capture their attention, and there's a lot of ways to do it. And it's an important, very important question, because if we don't engage those learners, then we're kind of wasting our time, quite honestly. So we need to make sure that they are paying attention while they're in there, meeting the completion standards that you both drive to and attain. But then walking away from that training and doing the things that we expect them to do on their job. So I think we'll close with that. We've got one last question for both of you. Where do you see the biggest opportunity, or where are you seeing innovation? Vicki, you mentioned AI as it relates to risk, but that's an example of innovation in training as well. But where do either of you, or both, if you want to jump in, see an opportunity for innovation in your programs over the next few years?
Well, I can start first, but I guess for the training piece of our program is also the investigation and the hotline, and it encompasses a lot. But I thus far have not seen a lot of AI as far as what we do in the compliance part of it, possibly in planning, but not in the investigation piece. Innovation, I guess I would just to try to focus more on the emerging risks and that's keeping updated, and a lot of cross-functional conversations with other areas to find out what their challenges are. So I think to make it more meaningful to the population that you're focused on is what our goal is, to have an effective program. So it's anything that can encourage that type of conversation in your company, I think would be helpful.
Great. Appreciate you focusing on training, because I know you're both responsible for a lot. So Jennifer, if you could do the same thing, but focus on, what you're thinking about as innovation within training.
Yeah, absolutely. So I probably sound like a lot of other people that you've heard out there, but I really think some of the most innovative things that we might see is really around using artificial intelligence responsibly to support kind of the efficiency and the effectiveness of your E&C program. So I know our team is really just getting started here in the last year of using AI a little bit in our program. And so from a training perspective, specifically, a couple of the things that I've done is I may have mentioned that we do a full analysis of our annual global training campaign once it's complete. And so, I've used AI. Once I had that training analysis complete, I uploaded it into our enterprise version of Copilot and, ask it to see, did it identify any trends in our training that I didn't see? I used it to help it write some formulas to analyze some data in some ways that I hadn't done before. And then we're also using it, within our broader program to do some things, to try some things like, I'll use it to help me write fun or lighthearted articles that may have to do with training or communications to our employees. I just did it in December to help me write one on holiday gift giving that I could review. And, I can write an article, but it might not be the most fun and lighthearted article. And so just using it in ways like that to support our program and especially training initiatives, those are some of the things that I can see really evolving over the next couple of years. So
Awesome. Well, listen, thank you both. Many, many thanks. And I know time is valuable, and you've donated some here to this audience, so I really appreciate it. Thoughtful, practical insights. Appreciate everybody that's joined. I know some are leaving. Thank you. As you exit the webinar, you're going to see a post-event survey pop up. It'll only take you a few seconds. We really appreciate your feedback. It'll help us improve these as we move forward. And a recording of the session, as I mentioned earlier, will be sent to you shortly. We hope this conversation gives you a few new ideas, and we wish you well on your 2026 programs. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of the week.
Thank you. You too.